In the series, I'm going to go over how I put together the scene. There are some custom shaders, there's wall shader, there's a little bit of compositing, and then a few geometry nodes, particle systems for the grass, the moss growing on these rocks, as well as these floating particles. And we'll go through all of the different techniques that I've employed to put together the scene. I'm a big fan of stylized shading, but a lot of the Toon shaders that I've found are lacking in a lot of ways. They tend to look very 3D, and that's something I try to mitigate with this workflow that I'm about to show you. In this video, we'll start off by going through the render settings and just general scene setup. And then we'll do the world shader. I'll show you how I set up my lights, and then we'll build the master shader group that goes on all these objects. In future videos, I'll go over putting together this entire scene, making the grass, making the scattering system for the moss, as well as the floating particles. And I'll go through some extra stuff like these guard rays, which is a paintbrush texture. And in fact, all of the grass strokes and foliage assets are paintbrush textures. Just a disclaimer, this tutorial is not really for beginners. I'm going to be brushing over a lot of concepts and shortcuts just to get it done. But if you go through slowly and copy all of my notes, you should be able to recreate what I made here. Okay, so we'll open up a fresh new Blender file and let's go through some render settings first. So we're using the Eevee render engine. I'm going to switch over to jittered shadows, remove temporal reprojection, change that to 64 to match the render settings, and then in the shadow we'll increase the rays to 2 and steps to 8. We're going to leave ray tracing disabled, and then in the performance tab we'll enable high quality normals, increase the shadow pool to 1 gig, and we'll turn on the GPU for the compositor. And then finally in the color management we'll change our view transform to standard. I'll just go to rendered view and turn on the compositor always. And finally we'll enable the mist pass, and let's also enable crypto mats. In this test scene I used the crypto mats to change the color of the door just because I wasn't getting a nice red look from the shader itself. So I'll show you how to do that as well. Okay, so now for a little bit of lighting, we're going to add in a sun lamp, and we're going to duplicate that sun lamp so we have a second one, and then I'll also add in an empty object to control the sun. So then we'll parent both suns to that sun controller. Okay, so now you might be wondering, why are we using 2 sun lamps? And I'll show you that right now. So let's say we add in, I'll just put together a little scene here just so that we can see the light interactions. And let's hide that first sun. Second one will give, or we'll hide the second sun. The first one will give a strength of 10, and let's go for a daytime scene, so we'll give it a little bit of orange. And then on the second sun, we'll give it a strength of about 6, and since that one was orange, we'll go a bit more to the red side and a bit more saturated. And then we'll also increase the angle of the second sun to about 5. And here you can see the effect that this gives off. You've got the hot color from the first sun, and then the second sun with higher angle allows that saturated color to bleed over into this transition area between shadow and light. And I think that gives quite a nice effect, especially when combined with the shader later. If I were to rotate it like this, and then rotate that second lamp a little bit less, you can see we can control how much of a fall off we get over there. We've got this nice fall off, but the quality of these shadows are not that great, so we'll enable jittered shadows for both of them. That'll just handle the smoothness of that fall off. And then for the first sun lamp, we'll leave overblow on 10%, drop the filter to 0, and increase this resolution limit to 0.01. And for the second lamp, we'll drop the overblow to 2, leave the filter on 0, and lower this to 0.0001. These are values that I've just found that work nicely through my experiments, but you are free to tweak those and make them work for your scene. I'll show you later, once we add in a few more objects, how these values affect the actual shading. The next step is to set up the wall shader. So currently it's just a single background node with a flat color, and this is the essence of the entire shader actually. just having one flat color as your shadow color. So if I open up the example again, you'll see that details in the shadows tend to fall to a flat color. And I feel like that's the reason that gives this whole piece the 2D feel, is having less detail in the shadows. I love using Pinterest for inspiration and to study different effects. And we see quite often that in the shadows, there's much less detail in a painted piece. Even going over here, you'll see these darker areas tend to fall to a flat color as opposed to showing more detail in them, and the detail is reserved for highlight areas. So for our wall shader, we'll basically just change the background color. I'm going to go for a slightly cooler bluish shadow color. We can enable transparent if you want to render with transparency. Otherwise, you can duplicate this background node, join them together. So we'll get the light path node with the ease camera ray into the factor. And now with the second one, you can change the background color without affecting the lighting of the scene. So this one will be for lighting, or for the shadows, and this one will be for the background color. For the background, I like to use an HDRI, specifically from this website called freestylized.com. They've got quite a few nice free stylized assets, especially skyboxes. Lovely stuff. You can go ahead and download one of these, and then we'll pull it in over here. And just like that, we have a nice toon sky. So this will be the wall shader. Okay, so let's build the shader. Okay, so I'll start off by deleting the principal, then add in a diffuse BSDF, and then turning this diffuse into a node group. And that's because for all of our objects, I want to be able to input a color channel, a roughness channel, and a normal channel. I won't be using any others like metallic or anything like that. And then we'll go from the diffuse, get a shader to RGB, and a color ramp. So if you've done any stylized work before, this little node setup will look familiar to you. You're basically turning the diffuse information into RGB information and then putting that through a color ramp. And most NPR workflows would then have you add in colors onto this color ramp, which is one way to go about it, but it's kind of a hard-coded way. Objects then won't respond to light correctly, retaining the colors of the light and colors of the environment, etc. So I'll be using this as a mask to affect the color channel. So basically, let's change this output to a color output. Let's just call this output. And I'll just put the color straight through to the output color. So over here, we can either select the flat color for our object, or we can plug in a color channel if your object has texture maps and stuff. So I'll just disconnect these two. We want our light mask to come from a plain BSDF without any color information. Okay, so with that set up, I'll put in our first mix, and this one's going to be set to lighted because this is going to be controlling where the highlights are. So as I've got it here, white is where the highlight is and black is where the shadow is. So we'll drag this about here. Drag this about here, put this in. So now we've got our base color. We're applying a lighten blending mode. So right now we're just lightening it with this color, and if we put in a different color there, we'll see that the light area takes on this color. And we can use the shader to RGB output before the color ramp because this still retains all of the actual colors. So it's still retaining the color of our sun lamp, the color of our shadows, etc. So we can pop that in over there, and this is what we get. Okay, so the next stage would be to add in the shadow areas, and this one I'll change to darken. Let's duplicate our color ramp, and for this stage I want to invert this color ramp so that the white is in the shadow area and the black is in the light area, because we only want to apply the darkened stage to the shadow area. So we'll plug that in over there. And once again, plug in our shader to RGB so that it actually takes in the walled lighting information. There we go. And here we'll have to mess around with our color ramps so that we get nice fall-offs and different stages of the lightening and darkening happening. And believe it or not, we are almost done. So the final step is to add in a rim light, something that catches along the edges. So right now, if you see, as we change this color, we don't see much happening in the highlight area, and that's because our lighten step is a bit too strong. So we'll just take this white value and bring it down. If it's all the way to black, this is the normal, our base color coming through, and we can increase this a little bit just so that it lightens it up and brings in a little bit of a sun lamp color. Okay, let's implement the rim light. So we'll require a texture coordinate node as well as a geometry node, and we'll calculate the dot product between the reflection output of that and the normal output of this. From here we can put this through a color ramp and look at our output, and it basically gives us a Fresnel node. If I were to add in Fresnel, it's basically an inverted Fresnel node. I just like the fall off that I get from this setup, as well as it performs a little bit differently on flat objects. So, flat hard surface objects. And I just prefer this one. So we will invert this so that we can control our edge over here. And we also don't want this edge light everywhere. We only want it where there's actually light. So I'll just duplicate my color ramp one more time. And I only want it to show up in the light areas. Then I can multiply these two together. Enable clamp so that it stays between 0 and 1. And there we go. We've got a nice edge light only where the actual light is. Let's just add in another light to illustrate that. There you go. Okay, so right now we've got our nice edge mask, although it's just white. So let's duplicate our mix node, switch this over to color, and then bring our shader to RGB, turn the factor up, and now our edge lamps will retain the color information of the light that's hitting it. So if I were to make this blue, there you go. We've got a dynamic edge light, and we will use the screen blending mode to bring that in. There we go. And that's our shader. So now let me just bring in a few other objects. These are some battles that I downloaded from freestylized.com. And let's bring in our node group. So this one over here, plug in our color, plug in our roughness, and plug in our normal. Just a tip for this, you want to lower your normal strength just a little bit. I find it helps with the 2D style. Currently, the roughness channel is not doing anything. You see the normal is affecting it though. And on the diffuse BSDF, the roughness literally doesn't do anything. So we can change that diffuse BSDF or principal BSDF, plug the normal in, plug the roughness in, and now roughness should work. We can see it here on the monkey because it's super glossy. So that's the basis of the shader. You're going to want to go through and just dial in some of these values just to, get a nice look out of it. Mess around with the shadows, where the shadows are placed. As you are dialing in your node tree, it's always a good idea to have an object that is just using a flat color, as well as an object that's using some texture maps, just to ensure that your, the shader works for both use cases. One thing I am noticing here is that we are still getting quite a bit of detail in the shadows, especially on these battles, and we can get around that by messing around with our world color. Okay, so one thing that we still notice here is in the shadows there's still quite a bit of detail, which I mentioned that I don't want, and that's because of this darken mode. So we can get around this by tweaking our world color. You'll see that it removes a bit of the detail, but this only works for very dark world colors. That's just the nature of the darken blending mode. So if I made this, like say I wanted, if we're looking at this here, say I wanted this as my shadow color, this is the result of the darken node on that. So we can choose a different blending mode. If we try something like multiply, we'll see that that kind of does something, but it's darkening everything as well. So still keeping quite a bit of detail in the shadows. So to get around all of this and to get that flat shadow look that I mentioned at the beginning, we'll just change this to mix. And mix is literally just going to place our shadow color in the shadow area. And if you remember, our shadow color comes from the shader to RGB. So that is just our flat world color. Cool, then another thing I like to do is to add a few controls so that when I duplicate the node group across different objects, I have a bit more control over how each of them responds. So the first one I'd like to do is add this slider for the rim light. So I'll just add it in there. And now for each object I can specify whether or not it has rim light and the intensity of it. And then one more thing that I like to add is the intensity of our light and step. So currently that intensity is sitting here in our color ramp, which is not super useful to us. So what we can do is just increase this to 1 and then add a map range node. Changes the float. So now it's mapping the 0 to 1 over here to 0 to 1. So basically doing nothing right now. If we lower this to max value, it's the same as making this color darker, this white color darker. So let's do 0.3 as a default and then include this as an input as well. So we can call this light intensity. For each object you can specify how bright the sun lamp actually makes it. Okay, and that's the end of the shader. So let me just add a new material to this ground plane just to walk you through the process one more time. So add a new material on the principal BSDF, Control Shift T, and then select the PBR map. So we'll take color, normal, and roughness. Bring those in. Delete the principal BSDF and add in our node group. And then connect up the color, roughness, and normal. Okay, so we see that it's kind of working, but it doesn't look too good. So the first thing we can do to help that is to remove the rim light from this object, because it is just a flat plane. The rim light gradient is basically going to be covering most of the plane at this angle. So remove the rim light and then mess around with the light intensity, because remember the light intensity is what's bringing in the sun lamp color into our lit areas. So if you want to reduce that, we can to retain some of that base color. Okay, so that's the end of it. Let me just show you the final node G. Okay, so that's it. That's my approach to stylized shading. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, leave a comment down below. If you get stuck with anything, I'm happy to help. If there's any questions or issues that arise, stay tuned for the next videos. We'll go over creating the scattering assets, implementing the brush strokes, tweaking the shader for the foliage, and yeah, we'll put together a cool little scene. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.